Off down to London again, hunting for composer Blue Plaques. And this time the two composers that I'm focusing on are Felix Mendelssohn and Béla Bartók, who both spent time in London during their composer careers. So I'll be taking you to the site of the Blue Plaque, which will show the buildings that they lived in when they were in the city of London. In Mendelssohn's case, obviously in the 19th century, and with Bartók in the early 20th century. Now let's start with Mendelssohn, and we're drawing here from the information on English Heritage, who are responsible for the plaque. It was erected in 2013 and it's at 4 Hobart Place, Belgravia. Now Mendelssohn lived between 1809 to 1847. He died fairly young, in fact, aged only 38. Imagine if he'd lived double that, the compositions we might have had, and perhaps, no doubt, more violin concertos. Felix Mendelssohn was a German composer of the early Romantic period. In his short life, he became internationally famous and was particularly loved by the English. He in turn loved England, and London in particular, staying at this property at 4 Hobart Place in Belgravia many times. His first sight of London left quite an impression on the young composer. "It is fearful, it is mad, I am giddy and confused," he wrote. "London is the grandest and most complicated monster on the face of the earth." Jacob Ludwig Felix Mendelssohn was born in Hamburg. His precocious musical talent first emerged at university in Berlin, where he was also a successful linguist, painter and draftsman. One of his earliest compositions, and perhaps now the most well-known, was Overture to a Midsummer Night's Dream, completed in 1826 when he was just 17. He was a genius, therefore. He went on to enjoy great success, becoming music director in Düsseldorf from 1833 to 1835, conductor of the Gewandhaus Orchestra in Leipzig from 1835, and Kapellmeister to the King of Prussia in Berlin from 1841. I often like to refer to Mendelssohn's violin concerto in E minor, the Opus 64, as a cathedral because it took him 6 to 7 years to complete. He relied heavily on his friend and concertmaster Ferdinand David for technical advice on the violin part. I guess the project was delayed by other commitments, but also it took him a while to perfect it, and that's why I call it a cathedral. And because the arts move in parallel, so we have, when we talk about Romanticism, literature, art, architecture, also the sciences and so many other things that are wrapped up in that time period, but of course classical music as well. I liken this work to a cathedral because it's on that scale of monumental impact on people. But of course he composed other works for violin as well, and his songs without words on violin are particularly beautiful. So, on to his British tours then. When Mendelssohn first visited Britain in 1829, his talent and personal charm saw him feted in musical circles and beyond. He was made an honorary member of the Philharmonic Society, and in 1824 he conducted this ensemble from the piano, using a white baton, a great novelty at the time. He visited England 10 times, fitting in a tour to Scotland that inspired the celebrated Die Hebriden Overture of 1830. Mendelssohn loved visiting Britain, but was less impressed with the musical standards he found. Of a performance of Handel's Messiah, he wrote, "Every note spoke loudly that an Englishman played it, and did not care over much about it." He is credited with having been a strong influence on the improvement of English musical life, and for inspiring English composers such as William Sterndale Bennett and Julius Benedict. He was also a great promoter of the works of Bach, Handel and Schubert. And in the case of Bach, with the time that Mendelssohn spent at Leipzig, walking in the footsteps of the great Baroque composer, he was instrumental in rediscovering Bach and bringing him back into the fore. He was a key individual in that process. And the fact that Bach's music was so widely embraced just shows how way far ahead of his time his music was, the music of Bach, that is. Now, on his many visits to London, Mendelssohn stayed at 4 Hobart Place in Belgravia, the home of the Hanoverian Embassy Secretary Karl Klingemann, who was his friend. The building forms part of a 3-storey terrace built in the 1830s and is now Grade 2 listed. Some other famous composers and performers lived in Belgravia, notably Mozart was one of the places that he stayed as a child when he visited London, and also the great Yehudi Menuhin, and I've made videos on those blue plaques which you can see in my channel. In total, Mendelssohn spent 4 months at this house over 4 or 5 separate stays, during which he conducted the Philharmonic Society on numerous occasions and also gave many organ recitals. It was from number 4 that he left to dine with Isambard Kingdom Brunel, which apparently he did not enjoy, and Charles Dickens, which he very much did enjoy. And it was to this address that he rushed back to give an account of his audience with Queen Victoria and Prince Albert in 1842. The Queen herself was also moved to write about the encounter. "Really, I've never heard anything so beautiful," she wrote in her diary. Poor Mendelssohn was quite exhausted when he had done playing, probably the stress of the occasion of performing in front of royalty as well. And no doubt the Queen could converse with Mendelssohn in their native German. Mendelssohn loved London. His first impression of the city was ambivalent, describing it in 1829 as the grandest and most complicated monster on the face of the earth. But later, when he wrote about London, he said, "There is no question that smoky nest is my preferred city and will remain so. I feel quite emotional when I think of it." And London is probably, for the most part, my favourite city too, alongside Geneva, which is a city I grew up living near to, just across the border in France. Felix Mendelssohn visited Britain 10 times between 1829 and 1847, with London serving as the primary hub for his performances, conducting engagements with the Philharmonic Society and social visits. His most notable documented visits to London occurred in 1829, 1830, 1832, 1833, 1835, 1837, 1840, 1842, 1844 and 1847. And some key details of these visits: in 1829, this was his first visit, he conducted his Symphony No. 1 and A Midsummer Night's Dream. In 1833, he conducted the debut of his Italian Symphony. In 1842, of course, he performed for Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. In 1844, he conducted 5 of the 8 Philharmonic concerts. And then in 1847, this was his final visit, where he appeared as a soloist and a conductor. And of course, he stayed at 4 Hobart Place in Belgravia with his friend Karl Klingemann during these trips. At his death in 1849, he was widely regarded as Europe's greatest composer. An obituary in the Times asserted that he loved England as heartily as his own home. Works for violin include Okay, so we've found the Felix Mendelssohn house at Hobart Place. And we can get a good view of the building from this side of the road. And this is the general area. Nice quiet part of London. And we'll just cross over the road to get a closer look of the plaque and the house. Now let's move on to Béla Bartók. Bartók visited Britain at least 16 times. His first visit was in 1904 when he gave a performance in Manchester of his symphonic poem Kossuth, composed in 1903, which commemorates the eponymous Hungarian national hero Louis Kossuth. A financial crisis in Hungary further encouraged him to work abroad, and Bartók came to London in the knowledge he could earn more here than in his native country. For reasons of economy, he chose to stay with his friend Sir Duncan Wilson at 7 Sydney Place in South Kensington. He did so at least a dozen times between 1922 and 1937, and is known to have given at least one recital inside the building, forming part of a terrace designed by George Persevi. The 4-storey house dates from the 1840s and is now Grade 2 listed. Bartók visited London multiple times, therefore, between 1922 and 1937, with his first visit occurring in 1922. During these trips, which totalled at least a dozen, maybe much more, maybe 16, he often performed and stayed at 7 Sydney Place in South Kensington. Some details regarding his visits. In 1922, he visited for the first time, and the visit was arranged by British composer Peter Warlock. He stayed with Sir Duncan and Lady Wilson at 7 Sydney Place. He also performed in London, including a notable reunion with violinist Jelly Daragny in 1922, for whom he wrote violin sonatas. With Hungary's leaders allied to the Nazis, Bartók left his homeland for the USA during the Second World War. His final years were dogged by financial worry, but his last work, Concerto for Orchestra, proved one of his most popular. At the time of death in New York at the age of 64, he had developed a reputation as a composer, pianist, and ethnomusicologist of great importance. The British composer and music critic Peter Warlock was a leading admirer of Bartók's music, and it was the Peter Warlock Society that proposed the Bartók Plaque. His works for violin include So we're now on the street where Béla Bartók used to stay when he was in London, and quite unexpectedly I stumbled across a statue of him at the entrance to the street. So if you do come here to check out the plaque, remember to also look at the beautiful statue of the great and interesting composer. Certainly his works of violin are very interesting. So now let's see if we can find his house at number 7, I believe. Okay, well, you can see the confusion where the Onslow Square becomes Sydney Place, which is across there. So that's 6 Sydney Place. Okay, well, I've just managed to completely miss it, and it is back across the road. I can see the blue plaque now. So, just as well, because we can get a better view of the building from here. Cross back over to number 7 Sydney Place, and here we are, and there is the blue plaque. Now, if you're going to come and visit the Béla Bartók plaque and statue, you may as well nip into the V&A Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, which is right nearby, because in there you have the chance to see a wonderful 1699, I think it is, Stradivarius. It's an unnamed Stradivarius. It's got a big crack in it, and I know it well because it's featured in a few of my videos, but as I'm right here, I might as well nip in and see an old friend. In terms of credits, thanks to English Heritage for the information that I've drawn on for this video.